So a little bit more about enforcement activities. We're going to talk a little bit about online patient reviews. So I first want to start, remember HIPAA was enacted back in 1996, which is quite a while ago, right? We didn't have the interactions with the internet like we do today. For those of you who may or may not remember Y2K, they thought the world was going to shut down in the year 2000 because all of our computers would go back. So if we think about the fact that HIPAA was actually enacted back in 1996 and the regulations were actually written in the late 90s, early 2000s, we didn't have patient reviews like we did in the past. And the other thing is patients weren't shopping for care as much as they are now. So you're looking for a new provider, you go on Google and you say, I'm interested in seeing, whatever, a dentist in Maple Grove, Minnesota, or an ophthalmologist in Plymouth, Minnesota. And from that, you see where you can go, and then you read reviews, and then you read reviews about how awful this organization is or how dirty it is, and you change your mind. So that's ultimately what's happening. However, the reality of I should probably start with this. So the other thing that we're facing in 2023 is that so much happens on the internet in 1 minute. So in 1 minute, it's hard to wrap your head around this. But in 1 minute on the internet, there's 167 million videos watched on TikTok. There's, $16.2 million or $10 million. Wish she had that, 16.2 million text messages sent. So if we think about what happens on the internet in a minute, it's a lot, right? And this is only increasing every single day. The other thing about the internet, though, is once it's out on the internet, you lose all control of it. I can speak about that from personal. My daughter threw these frozen pants up in the air one time, and I posted it online, and within 24 hours, it had over 20 million views. It still pops up. I mean, there's a whole Reddit channel on it that people talk about this video. And it's I started fighting it like people were stealing it. I'm sure someone's making money off of it. I'm not, but I'm sure someone is. And so it's you try to fight it, but eventually you have to go, I'm the one that posted it online. I lose control. Now, why does that matter to healthcare? Is because if something gets posted online, sometimes it's always going to be there. Even though they say sometimes it goes away, it really doesn't. So I always like to talk a little bit about, before we dive in the patient reviews, there was an example of this that happened, probably 8 or 9 years ago. There was a famous football player that was injured in a firework. He was shooting out fireworks on 4th of July, and he got an injury and ended up in the hospital with a career-ending injury ultimately. And someone took a picture of his operative record and posted it on Twitter. Then people retweeted it and retweeted. And then what happened is this individual filed a complaint with the government, filed a complaint with the hospital. And I mean, there's a lot of enforcement happening, but he basically, the federal government enforced, he sued, the person got fired who was working for ESPN that posted it. I can still find that tweet today. It takes 2 seconds. So that's my point in telling that story, is that it never really goes away, even though you think it does. Same kind of aspect to what's happening with online consumer reviews. And this is a very frustrating thing to healthcare organizations, right? Because you can treat the patient the best you can. And if they're either non-compliant with what you've requested, or they just are a grumpy person and they're just never going to be happy, they can go online and just, post a review that is negative, and you're angry, as you're like, oh my goodness, we tried everything. This patient just wouldn't listen to us. And because of that, this happened. And that has happened a few times where the responses actually caused an unauthorized use or disclosure of health information. So the 2 examples that had enforcement happened to just be dental offices. I didn't pick them out because they just happened to be, but this is the 2 examples, and then I'll talk about the response. So this was the first one that had an enforcement with it, but basically a patient posted a negative review of an organization on the organization's Google review page. The patient used a pseudonym because he didn't want to reveal his real name. He just was posting because he didn't feel his care was appropriate and he wasn't happy. Okay. This was the response, and I'm not going to read this all because we would be here for a while, and I know we're a little bit short on time. But the provider, the dentist, actually wrote this exact information. And where you see patient, they actually listed the patient's name. So you can see it's so fascinating that this patient made unsubstantiated claims when he was only on my practice in 2 occasions and, hasn't been seen since this date. So again, they're listing dates. A little bit further down, he talks about the fact that the patient had excruciating pain in the lower left quadrant. Again, you can't talk about that. He was given a second referral for a root canal treatment to be performed by one of my colleagues. He's obviously talking about the person in general, but he's basically saying we didn't actually treat you. We didn't actually do any procedures on you. We didn't actually bill your insurance. So that's he's like telling the whole patient story basically in this response. Unfortunately, even if this was true, it doesn't matter. You can't respond in this way when you're responding to those requests. So in this specific one, there was a $10,000 fine with a corrective action plan. And then in the end of 2022, there was another example pretty similar where a dental organization was having all these negative reviews on Yelp and they were not very happy. So one of the things I gave you to review is an article I wrote in coordination with Yelp, which was years ago, but I think it's still pertinent to today. So this organization was super unhappy. So they went through and started responding to the negative Yelp reviews and including information from patient visits and patient insurance information to basically try to prove, I should say, that the organization was good. It was just the patient that was bad. Multiple patients actually went together and filed a complaint with the federal government, which ultimately an OCR investigation was opened and they actually received an enforcement of $23,000 and a corrective action plan. And, from a healthcare organization, sometimes you think, oh, $23,000 isn't a lot of money. It is for these small organizations, right? This might be enough money to put someone out of business. So the other thing though, is the corrective action plans. And I'll dive into that in a minute. But again, our OCR director came forward and said, this is the latest enforcement. Providers cannot disclose protected health information when responding to online reviews. We're sending a clear message that you need to protect patients' information. We're going to take it seriously. So the question is, how do you respond, right? Because sometimes you're like, oh my goodness, there she goes again, complaining. You have to state with it's our practice or our policies. You can't, say the patient was here, you can't release information. So I always encourage people to have 1 or 2 people that are designated to respond to these individuals. And that as part of that, you have a statement. So it is our practice that everybody has a positive experience at our organization. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact us at blank, and then leave it at that. And you respond to both positive and negative reviews if you're going to choose to respond that way. So just some information on that. But a little bit more about how the process worked, right? So the patient filed a complaint with the OCR. They opened an investigation. They requested copies of the organization's policies and procedures and training documentation. Now, one of the things I find interesting with this is they specifically asked for use and disclosure policies in response to online reviews. Well, that's not written in HIPAA again, right? It doesn't say you have to have a policy and procedure for online reviews. So again, provides us greater expectations on what's happening. The dental office actually acknowledged that they did the responses and that they don't have policies and procedures, and they only have a notice of privacy practices, which doesn't discuss online reviews. So that's when the OCR requested the additional information this should be $23,000 fine that they got. All right, we went through this one. I want to get to the last section before we wrap up. But really looking at, again, OCR investigations. So common findings from these investigations when it comes to patient access, the assumption that the notice of privacy practices is all that is necessary is false. Not having comprehensive privacy and security and breach requirement or policies and procedures, lack of understanding what HIPAA compliance is a pretty common thing. Not providing everything requested by the OCR. If they request it, you provide it. I will. If the federal government's requesting things, provide them those things. And then The other thing they found in this specific scenario is they also didn't have periodic security training for their staff, privacy and security training. So I wanted to dive into a little bit about the corrective action plans, because I think those are kind of lost. You see these fines and you're like, oh my goodness, a fine. But the corrective action plan, I think, is maybe a little bit more expensive. So the corrective action plans, and I was actually going to pull one up. Just give me 1 second. I had one up and available for, I have too many things open here. So I just pulled up one of the latest HIPAA fines. So this was one in 2023 for the patient's right of access. But if you click on this specific resolution agreement, you can actually see the specific resolution agreement. I'm just going to scroll down. So it talks about this is what happened. There's some legal stuff in here, but this right here, this corrective action plan, people don't pay attention to, but I think that this is painful for an organization. So this specific organization, in response to not only getting a fine, also had to do all of this, right? They had to update their policies and procedures within 60 days. And then they had to provide them to the federal government, and the federal government is going to approve or deny them. Once they're approved, the organization has to implement and train within 30 days. So, okay, write new policies, get it updated, send it to the federal government, get approval. Once the approval is there, actually implement the policies and procedures, and make sure that you provide evidence of implementation. Additionally, making sure that they're distributing their policies and procedures to workforce members and as appropriate to business associates, as well as to new workforce members. Make sure that policies and procedures have a written or electronic acknowledgement, and make sure that they update policies and procedures. And anytime you update them, you have to prove that you also trained your staff if there's substantial revisions. Minimum information that should be included in the policies is also here. They put a little bit about training. So you have to train your workforce. You have to send us your training beforehand so that we can approve it. Once we give your training back, you only have, 60 days to train. You have to train every year after that. And any new employees you have to train within 30 days. You have to certify that you attended training, and then the specific organization has to review the training to reflect the federal government. In addition, they have to provide an annual report. So every year they have to send a report to the federal government that basically says that these are the policies and procedures that were updated. This is the training material we used. This is a documentation that we did all of our training. And this is that we, we're telling the truth on our implementation report. You also have to send a report that talks about your training, your attestation, any revisions, any summaries of corrective action or preventable. If you had any reportable incidents, you have to respond to them. And anytime you have an incident, so this one was specifically to patient access. So if you have another patient access issue, you have to tell the government right away as well. So I know I'm going on and on, but there is a lot of information in here that they have to do. And so why I talk about this may be more expensive than the actual breach itself, it's because someone has to manage this day in and day out now and work with the federal government. So just, if you Google HIPAA resolution agreements, I think they're fascinating to go through to see what organizations have to do and comply with. And I always tell people, learn from the mistakes of others. You can't live enough to make them all yourself. So we do have one section left. Any questions on the online reviews?